someone told me this, so this could be wrong, that veganism and plants is actually hurting animals more. Isn't there something, can you explain that?
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit earlier. So when someone makes this intentional choice to be vegan or vegetarian, great first step. We can go back to the health issue, but let's just put the health issue aside. Let's talk about environmental issues or ethical issues. I think a really laudable thing that vegans and vegetarians may believe is that they don't want to cause excess suffering in the world. Great. What we understand as humans, and this is a very interesting thing for most of us that didn't grow up in the woods, is that in order for something to live, something else must die. This is just the way life works. And it's kind of a hard thing that we wrestle with as kids. Like, I don't want to hurt anything, but this is the way of life, right? There's an interesting woman named Leah Keith who was a previous vegan. She became a meat eater, and she tells this story of having a garden. And she wanted to be a vegan, and she had this garden, but she realized that to have a garden, she had to kill the slugs because the slugs were eating her lettuce, and she had to put in manure or animal products to get the plants to grow well. And so she realized, look, manure came from an animal that didn't have to be killed, but the bones and the calcium that had to come from an animal. And so there's a cycle of life and death, and you're going to kill slugs to even create the plants. But let's just think more broadly about plant agriculture. How do you grow plants? How is kale grown or spinach grown? It's grown in a field, probably in the Central Valley of California or somewhere, that was at one time trees. And at one time there were voles and, mice or, rabbits living there with snakes and beetles and bugs and birds in those trees. And so in order to get to that land to be able to grow plants, you have to cut all that stuff down. Then you have to till the soil. And when you till the soil, you destroy the topsoil. So this is kind of boring soil, science, but the soil is a really interesting ecosystem, like our life science in the 8th grade. There's all sorts of things in the soil. There's all sorts of bacteria and fungi that are working together. There's earthworms. And when you till the soil, you release all the carbon dioxide in the soil. It just goes up into the atmosphere. So you're emptying the soil or the topsoil of the carbon dioxide. You're sort of destroying the soil. One way to kill ground and make it very bad for planting in your garden at your house or to grow plants is to till the soil. So at this point, you've leveled the trees, so you've killed trees, you've displaced birds, potentially killed rabbits and voles and anything else living in the soil. When you're tilling, you're killing the things in the soil.
Not to mention then harming the things that eat those things.
Exactly. So think about the tens of thousands of lives that are lost in the creation of a field to grow plants. And then you're growing the plants. Hopefully you're not putting pesticides on those plants, right? And if you are putting pesticides, is it glyphosate or some other pesticide, which is water soluble and leading into the water table and is ending up in our water table. So now you're harming everything downstream of that, whether it's animals, anything else in the life cycle that is eating those animals is going to bioaccumulate the glyphosate. It's going to end up in our water supply. So unless you're purifying your water, it has pesticides and glyphosate in it. And then you might have to put nitrogen fertilizer back in the soil because without animal input into soil, you will quickly deplete the nutrients required to grow those plants. So this has been happening for generations. And if you talk to any farmer, I'm good friends with Will Harris, who runs White Oak Pastures in Georgia, and I've been to that farm. It's so fascinating. I mean, in the 1930s and 1940s, these sort of fertilizer salesmen made a killing because they came with this nitrogen fertilizer that was discovered sort of in the World War II effort, I believe, and it allowed plants to grow, but it's a fake solution. It's not actually the nutrients that animals put back in. But what they do at White Oak is they have cows on the land, right? So what people don't realize is that when you have animals living on the land, you create a fertile soil and plants that grow just mightily. They grow so well. That's how the grasslands in the United States were grown. Millions of bison pooping and peeing and walking and pressing their poop and pee into the ground, which moves all the nutrients back into the soil. It's a cycle. The ruminant animal, which is an animal with cloven hooves like a goat or a cow or a bison or something, eats the grass, which humans can't eat because of the silica. Grass is not a food for humans. And then they cycle it back into the ground. So none of those nutrients are lost. They're putting it back into the ground, and they actually increase the carbon in the soil. So they're sequestering carbon into the soil, which is kind of where it belongs. So there's a real difference between plant agriculture and animal agriculture. And what people also fail to appreciate is that the way to have healthy plants is to put animals on the land, because the poop and the pee from animals is what makes the soil healthy. And then you get amazing plants. The grass at White Oak Pastures is nuclear green, and it's neon green. It's the brightest green I've seen. And there's bugs and birds. And when they move the cattle, I got to see them move 1,000 head of cattle from one field to another. These cows are so excited. They just run into this field, and it's just all grass that's regrown over the last few weeks. It's just like a buffet for them of the best, most evolutionarily appropriate, healthy food for cows. And they just run in and they all spread out and they start eating this grass. And then there's birds and bugs. It's just like It's just the way life is supposed to be, right? It's mirroring the way that these ruminants have moved on the land. So there's a real stark juxtaposition between what happens when you grow plants and when you can grow animals if you do it correctly. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. I've never heard it explained like that. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So from a moral standpoint, like even if you are growing plants the way that we do now, like there's something is dying. And
Exactly.
I think
So like the underlying vibe of the self-righteousness, because there is a little bit of self-righteousness can sort of be eliminated now after learning that.
Yeah. And look, you're going to have to kill one of those cows to feed a person. But you think about how much nutrition comes from one single life of a cow who has the end of its life. I mean, every animal on that field is going to die at one point, either by old age or if they're in the wild and it's the bison cousin of a cow, it's going to get taken down by
I think people also
wolf.
forget when things get killed in the wild, it's not like people talk about being humane.
Right.
If you've ever seen predators kill prey, it is, I mean, I had a dog, unfortunately, it passed away, and it was, we a long time ago when I was a kid, but a bunch of coyotes got into our yard. And it wasn't like a humane kill. Like they ate this thing from the ass up while it was still alive. And like, that's how they kill in the wild. It's not a nice way to go. I would argue that it's more humane sometimes if a hunter takes out an animal that's getting older and maybe going, because what happens is these animals age and they get old and they get slow and the pack kind of leaves them, and then predators come in and they eat them, and they do it in a very violent, vicious way where they suffer.
Yeah. And the way that, so there's a couple of ways that cows can be raised if we talk about cows. And the best way is the blueprint of white oak pastures and other farms that are regenerative doing it that way. And they're raising the cows on the land. They're rotating fields. They're only eating grass from the day they're born. I mean, I guess they're eating milk from their mothers, but grass and milk, what they're supposed to eat. And then when they're harvested, when they're killed, they're done in a very humane fashion. There are ways that cattle ranchers do this that are kinder, quote unquote, to the cattle. And that may sound crazy, but what happens is you lead the cattle into this area where they're sheltered. It's kind of like a security blanket, and they don't freak out. They're in a paddock where there's supports on both sides, and then they use a bolt gun, and their life is over in an instant. It's essentially like a hunter killing an animal with one shot with a rifle. And look, it sounds crazy and we don't want to believe it, but we have to go back to what you said. There's always death to support life. And so I think that just gives us an imperative as humans. If I'm eating any food on the planet, whether it's a piece of kale or spinach or a cow, I should understand and appreciate that and kind of do the best I can in my life to honor that cycle, because I will be a part of that cycle at some point in my life.
I think people envision the way like some humans die of old age, where you go peacefully in your sleep. It's like, that's not how it happens in the wild. They go and a pack of wild animals literally tears them apart limb from limb while they're still breathing and living. Like that's just how it goes. Like, that's the cycle of life out there in the wild.
Exactly.